In the first chapters of Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain, two doctors are dispatched into a small town in the middle of nowhere by the US government after they lose contact with two soldiers that were stationed there. What the men are greeted with upon entering the town is something that conjures up horrific images in the mind of the reader. Sprawled out as far as the eye can see are lifeless bodies, the entire population of the town dead. Their faces twisted in surprise, their bodies contorted in states that suggest a sudden affliction that took their life. Almost as though whatever killed them came upon them in moments. People of all ages, elderly to infants, suddenly dropped into the streets. If this wasn't enough to haunt the men for the rest of their lives, upon entering the homes and businesses in the town, they discover bodies in very different states. Not everyone just dropped dead. Some took matters into their own hands. Though the methods may have differed, death resulted all the same, and from the same cause, death came. The doctors find the bodies of the two soldiers along with what they were sent there to recover, the source of what brought this plague upon this quiet town, what swept through and took the lives of everyone here, save two. An old man wanders through the streets in a state of delirium, and a baby weeps in a crib. Two survivors that hold the key to stopping what is now at risk of running rampant across the entire country. A killer with no body, shape, form, prejudice, or personality. The killer in The Andromeda Strain is a virus, an invisible murderer from the stars, and a race has begun to stop it. So often, the genre label of horror is reserved for a very specific type of style that a work takes on. The graphic nature of death or dismemberment, the physical or psychological torment of the characters, or most often, the nature of the threat therein. If the killer is a killer, i.e. wearing a mask or having a custom weapon of some kind, the label of horror is slapped onto it immediately. There's a distinction that many make between the labels of horror and thriller in entertainment. Almost like horror is some kind of dirty word, while thriller carries a level of respect or prestige more valuable than the genre that is home to our iconic slashers. A movie about a giant shark that rips people apart, leaving nothing but remains washed up on a beach, or a bloody limb sinking to the bottom of the ocean? Yeah, that may technically be horror, but we can't call it that. It's a beloved classic that wasn't even rated R. No, that's an adventure thriller. A movie about a serial killer that kidnaps women with the intention to murder and skin them in order to make a suit out of their flesh, where our protagonist's only hope of catching him is to consult another imprisoned serial killer who consumes the flesh of his victims? This movie is rated R and is way more graphic and explicit than Jaws, but we gave that Best Picture. What would the world think if a dirty horror movie got Best Picture? No. Silence of the Lambs isn't horror, it's a psychological thriller. My issues with genre labels that I'm sure will lead to several debates in the comments aside, even amongst us horror nuts, there's a specific type of subgenre that I think there's far more room for that debate within. When reading The Andromeda Strain and letting my imagination run wild, I couldn't shake the idea that while definitely at home in the science fiction thriller genre, there are some moments in this novel that I would confidently categorize as horrific. Actually, a lot of stories that deal with the outbreak of an unknown affliction have these moments that delve from the sterilized white rooms of controlled facilities and peel back the curtain to plant our gaze firmly upon the brutal reality of what an uncontrollable virus strain can truly do to a society that is tragically unprepared for it. There have been very popular stories told throughout the years about outbreaks, the toll they take on civilization, and the intelligence that tries to stop them. But I feel that this specific subgenre of virus horror is a bit underrated, and I want to take some time to explore it a little. Look at some of its common elements, show how some of its moments can be truly defined as horror, and try and examine why these kinds of stories can be so effective, even to the point that we revisit them while living through the very reality that they depict. I went into this video with a few examples of these types of stories already in mind that I wanted to talk about, but to expand the discussion a little bit, I decided to look up some more examples that deal with a virus as a threat, and not surprisingly, a lot of the results were movies and video games where the end result of their fictional viruses were horrific mutations that led to humans and animals transforming into zombies, or zombie-like creatures. You already know what I'm talking about. The Last of Us, 28 Days Later, The Living Dead and Return of the Living Dead series, World War Z, the list goes on. And while I do find the best of these stories to be highly entertaining and, in the case of The Last of Us, emotionally powerful, these aren't exactly the examples that I was looking for. For the purposes of this video, I'm interested in the stories that deal with the outbreak of a disease, the attempts to contain it, and the effects that it has on people as it slowly gets worse. A lot of the aforementioned media deals with the end results, the post-apocalypse, where everyone has already resorted to survivalist tendencies and the outbreak has long since consumed the civilized world. For this video, I'm interested in the beginnings of a potential cataclysm, stories of the first casualties of an unknown strain, and the desperate attempts to find out where said strain originated and how to stop it. The novel that I began this video talking about, The Andromeda Strain, entirely revolves around a small group of intelligence attempting to understand the titular strain, which is extraterrestrial in origin since it was brought back to Earth on a satellite. There's a haunting amount of realism to this novel. It's presented in a cold, matter-of-fact style, with several sections written as communication transcripts, computer readings, and models, which is something that Crichton would become known for. The addition of these elements makes the events feel all the more plausible. Crichton details the various methods that the group of scientists have to go through in order to sterilize themselves before they even get to examine anything related to the Andromeda strain. It's a tense thriller, with every single discovery feeling monumental as if the fate of the world is at stake. This is the feeling that I'm searching for. The unease that comes from characters entering a room with an infected individual, and the dread that comes from even the slightest mistake. A mistake that can lead to the spread of something that we, as a species, simply aren't prepared for. The horror element of virus horror comes from the realization that no matter how advanced we may be in terms of medication, treatment, or cleanliness, there are still things out there in the natural world that can sneak their way into our very biology and harm us in a way that even our most advanced methods of medical science can do nothing about. Of course, these stories can also be used to comment upon various aspects of our society in the face of near destruction. On a larger scale, you have story elements that focus on those in charge, government entities working with disease control, not just looking for cures, but trying their best to project the amount of casualties and contain the spread of misinformation and panic, because in some cases, that can be even more dangerous than the spread of infection itself. It's that reflection on human nature that makes regular, scared people in these types of stories just as frightening as the disease that threatens them. They're either conduits for infection spreading from person to person, they're panicked people turned desperate or violent, or they're spreading false claims, propagating ideas that are harmful and counterintuitive to the efforts of those in charge who are trying to stop things from becoming catastrophic. One of my absolute favorite disease movies is the 1995 film Outbreak. It's a film that focuses a lot more on over-the-top thrills than realism, but director Wolfgang Petersen does a great job in showing us the scale of what something like this could do and putting our protagonists in the face of what seems like impossible odds. In Outbreak, we're told immediately what the source of the virus is, a monkey, and what said virus can do to a small population right before the opening credits. As the virus runs rampant throughout a small California town, it becomes clear to our group of military experts that it's only going to get worse unless the source of the virus is found, but that's easier said than done, as we're shown the host monkey being released into a large forest. Outbreak is full of thrills, and I love the way that each new development is introduced. It has that high-octane 90s editing style, with some pretty creative camera work to convey the spread of an invisible killer that only seems to get stronger. Each time the stakes are raised, they're punctuated by an intense music sting and one-liner that's granted a little cheesy, but in the best way possible.
It's airborne.
Another element that Outbreak throws in to make things even harder on our protagonists is Donald Sutherland's character, who acts as a sort of secondary antagonist to the story. At the beginning of the film, it's shown that this character is willing to stop the spread by any means necessary, even bombing a small village to kill off any of those infected. This puts the entire town at risk because not only are they dealing with an unprecedented biological threat, they're under the supervision of a military leader who has no problem just totally wiping them out. This element of the story calls the extent of power that military and government officials are given in these situations into question, reinforcing the film's position that those who are experts should be trusted and military action against civilians is never justified, even in a state that seems near hopelessness. It's a welcome bit of commentary, even if Sutherland's character is a bit over-the-top evil in my opinion. The actual horror of Outbreak comes from its use of dramatic irony. One of my favorite sequences is when the character of Jimbo, played by Patrick Dempsey, is seen interacting with the host all day, unknowingly putting himself at risk of exposure. This sets off a ticking time bomb, while we wait in anticipation for when his collapse will happen, and every interaction that he has with other characters is tinged with suspense. When he does finally succumb to the virus, we're shown in gruesome detail what's in store for everyone who's exposed to this deadly strain, and it's in sequences like these that the medical disaster or virus subgenre borrows from another subgenre of horror: body horror. The terror of body horror sets itself apart from the terror of a haunting or monster movie or a slasher because while we can run away from a physical threat and even defend ourselves if we're resourceful enough to do so, we can't outrun our own bodies. The types of diseases and infections present in these types of stories attack our basic motor functions, leave us helplessly bedridden, or worst of all, literally tear us apart. Cabin Fever is concerned with one thing and one thing only: showing you some of the most disgusting, painful results of a flesh-eating bacteria you'll ever see. While this movie definitely has a tongue-in-cheek, darkly comedic tone, it does effectively portray some real disgusting shit, emphasizing the type of shock that can come from our bodies peeling at a rate that we have no hope of stopping. Cabin Fever is a pretty hopeless movie in general. There's no silver lining to be found here because the characters aren't biologists or experts that have any method of figuring out what exactly is happening to them, nor do they come in contact with anyone who appears to. This is a story of regular people. Clueless, regular people who would normally be the catalyst for the remainder of the plot in a film focused on the attempt to find a cure. It scales the story down to just a few people and savors every gory detail. While the Andromeda Strain and Outbreak show us the haunting aftermath, Cabin Fever shows us the deaths and spread happening in real time on the unsuspecting innocent, the beginning of what will soon be the masses of infected. So far, we've taken a look at stories that cover the regular hapless masses, the experts trying to stop the spread or find a cure, and the struggles that each of those parties face, from government overreach to painful body horror. But there's one area that we have yet to look at, and it's a part to these kinds of narratives that I find to be very interesting. Most of us can readily identify with normal people just trying to survive, and even the experts that we may not fully relate to on an intellectual level are still just people. They have families, loved ones, and their own struggles that weigh on their minds as they toil away in laboratories or enter dangerous locations where infection is all but guaranteed unless the proper precautions are taken. Virus horror scares us because we relate to the struggles of those who are faced with it. But what about the individuals who can afford to seemingly get through any catastrophe unscathed? The elite, the rich and powerful. These are the people who can not only afford to protect themselves hiding behind their wealth, but can also easily afford to offer aid to those who are less fortunate, but of course they don't. You know the type of people I'm talking about. Those who keep their mega churches closed during hurricanes, flee the state that they represent during a catastrophic freeze, and honestly, just look up billionaire behavior, there's plenty examples that you can find. It's in one of the earliest pieces of fiction that fit into this subgenre that you'll find a deadly plague sweeping the country and the wealthy aristocracy learning very quickly that a plague doesn't discriminate based on class. Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death takes place in a land that has been completely decimated by a plague known as the Red Death. A wealthy prince named Prospero, along with 1,000 other members of the aristocracy, wall themselves up in his castle and have lavish parties, not caring whatsoever about the millions who are suffering beyond the walls and intending to just wait the whole thing out. Prospero's castle is a Gothic nightmare, with a maze-like structure and several rooms painted in bizarre colors, with one being decorated a pitch black that even the affluent guests are afraid to venture into. There are several ways to interpret this short story, the significance of the different rooms, and the chiming of the clock that frightens everyone for a moment each hour. I personally see that final dark room as a reminder of the reality that these people are choosing to escape from and are ultimately afraid to confront. They're supposed to fear nothing with all of their riches and their ability to isolate themselves from the world, yet that chiming clock and that black room are symbolic of two things that they cannot escape: the ravages of time and death itself. And death does eventually come for them. A shrouded, masked figure appears at the castle at midnight and slowly passes through each of the rooms. The guests, way too terrified to confront it until finally Prospero angrily approaches the figure with a dagger, only to scream and drop dead. The shrouded, masked figure is not a person, but the Red Death itself. This entity, this disease that doesn't care how powerful or wealthy anyone at this masquerade is, has finally arrived to take them all. And it does. The Masque of the Red Death, although framed as a more gothic and supernatural story, does confront several realities of the ravages of disease. The guests at the masquerade believed that they were separate from the masses and that their class would somehow protect them from a plague that, although named the Red Death in the story, is actually described to be more like tuberculosis, a very real illness that at the time was kind of a death sentence, as medical science had not yet developed to properly treat it. In the present day, it comforts us to believe that we're advanced enough to not have to fear facing a biological threat that we're unprepared for. More often than not, the idea seems so foreign that artists create these fantasies for us to indulge in, allowing ourselves to be scared by the spectacle of it all, but knowing deep down that it's just fiction. The filmmakers and writers even stylize their work to assure us all that this is just escapism that we're paying to see. You can tell just by looking at some of the sequences where things get worse in Outbreak or the gory messes in Cabin Fever that the intent isn't to make us reflect on our own morality as a species, observe how those of a different class behave during a pandemic, criticize those in power beyond that of making them cartoonish supervillains, or portray the effects and reactions to a virus as realistically as possible. There is, however, one movie that does seek to touch upon just about everything I've talked about so far and do it in a way that feels unflinchingly real. Its brutality being best observed by simply contrasting how a character succumbs to the virus back to back.
Clark.
Oh my God, is he dead?
Steven Soderbergh's 2011 film Contagion is probably the very best virus horror film that I've ever seen, because it doesn't attempt to dress its narrative up in any way. The people react as real people do. There's mass panic, the CDC attempting to work out a vaccine, the stresses of quarantine, the poor taking desperate measures to receive help, conspiracy theorists spreading false information, and insane casualties. It's in the portrayal of those casualties that I think Contagion is the most effective as a virus horror film. We're so conditioned to the main characters of these stories pulling it off at the last minute that we think anyone who receives top billing is untouchable. Both them and children, who films just have an aversion to harming in general, but Contagion pulls no punches. The deaths are horrific, but in a much colder way. Contagion doesn't need insane gore effects to drive home just how painful a sudden and unexpected loss of life can be. The film doesn't have that Hollywood thriller sheen over it. Even the conclusion is bittersweet, to say the least. There's no nuclear bomb threat from the government to thwart, nor is the host found so a vaccine can be administered before the spread goes too far. Millions of people die, and by the time that there is a vaccine, it's implied that the world will never be the same, and the virus will not be eradicated entirely because some parts of the world take priority over others according to the powers that be. We're not even told where the virus spawned from until the finale, and by this point, it doesn't really matter. The world is left to wonder what caused things to spiral out of control, and the people are left to try to return to normal. I love both Outbreak and Contagion, but I love them for very different reasons. One is a highly entertaining time capsule of the 90s disaster film with some standout sequences that remind me of what the very best cheesy medical disaster movies can be, while the other is a much more poignant examination of just how rapidly things can take a turn for the worst when humanity is confronted with something that it simply isn't prepared for. Having been released in 2011, there's a much more modern feel to the narrative, with our current era of information being the forefront of one of the film's many plotlines. Social media plays a role in Contagion, and having checked social media in the year 2020, I saw several people making interesting parallels to what happened in the movie to another small, insignificant event that happened that year. One of the more fascinating things that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic, at least to me, was the resurgence in popularity of both Outbreak and Contagion. Everybody was booting up Netflix to watch movies about an unprecedented global medical disaster while living through a very real medical disaster. I'd love to sit here and point out how silly that is, but I was one of them. Yeah, I watched both of these movies while in lockdown, and I think I finally figured out why Outbreak, Contagion, and the other works of fiction that I've talked about here are so popular, even if they sometimes hit a little too close to home. While Cabin Fever is more comically nihilistic and the Poe story is very much intended to scare audiences, as the events of Outbreak and Contagion reach their peak, there's a sense of camaraderie, cooperation, and hope that comes through. Outbreak presents us with a badass, over-the-top conclusion where the heroes defeat the human villain and cure the virus. And it's even implied that our protagonist will get back together with his estranged wife. Contagion, while much more bleak in its portrayal of a world now scarred by the effects of the pandemic, does show that world moving on. People are able to reclaim small amounts of normalcy in their lives. And there are those who do the right thing when several in this story choose not to. The conclusions to virus horror stories are often this bittersweet. Even the Andromeda strain sort of fizzles out, with the climax being more centered on one of the scientists disarming a bomb that threatens to blow up their research facility, while the actual virus mutates into a much more harmless state. Even so, the reason I feel that these kinds of stories become bestsellers, do very well at the box office, and make their way into the public consciousness amid a very real global pandemic is simply that they do show us the best of what humanity can be. The greatest minds coming together to serve one great purpose. The odds being bravely faced despite great uncertainty, and I think, most poignantly, people helping other people. These stories are scary. They show us death and destruction that can reach us in ways that other pieces of fiction can't, but I think the reason that so many fans and critics don't focus on the actual horror elements of these stories very often is because they're captivated by the parts that show us the best of who we can be when united under a single cause, and I think there's something pretty cool about that. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Recommend to me in the comments one of your personal favorite types of these virus horror stories or pandemic stories or video games. I'd love to hear more in this underrated subgenre. Also, tell me if there's another underrated subgenre of film, video game, or story that you'd like to see me take a look at in the future. I want to thank my patrons for supporting me and making these videos possible, with, as always, a very enthusiastic shout out to my executive producer patron, Lapis Lazuli VA. Thank you so much for your support. I actually intended for this video to come out way earlier, but ironically enough, I actually got sick while making it. And considering the subject matter of this video, that's kind of hilarious. There are several more videos coming, and please be sure and check out some of the other videos that I've made. Once again, thank you so much for watching my video, and I'll see you next time.